I imagine you've been asked that on this American tour just about
I have
every
a bit, yeah, and
10
I usually
minutes.
immediately fight back by saying, how do you define communism? Which usually shuts the interviewer up for 5 minutes. But is
it a debate? I mean, it's on the agenda, and there is a lot of gloating, as you say, but is there a debate going on? I mean, maybe in the left, but...
is there a debate? You mean it's the validity of left-wing thought? Are you questioning that?
Is it a debate over the ideology of communism versus capitalism, or is it just a bit of gloating that's going to go away that will, reinforce?
No, I think if you look at the American media, particularly the sort of lowest common denominator kind of media, the kind of debate that seems to be going on there is it's all over and we won and that's over. Communism was an experiment and it's over. But really, the whole idea of left-wing thought was born because capitalism had failed to deliver an equal and fair society to everyone. And as long as there are people sleeping on the streets of this country, as long as there are people starving in the third world, as long as there are masses out there in the darkness being exploited so that a few people in Western Europe and North America can live the life of luxury, then the ideals of socialism, communism will always be valid.
How does that play in the United Kingdom? Where Thatcher and the Tories are in such a terrible state if you look at the polls, but yet alternatives to what's gone on in the last decade in Britain don't seem to be there. Certainly there are lefties everywhere you look in Britain, and some of them 80, 90 years old, but the alternatives to what's happened in the last decade, where are they?
Well, I think for a long time the Labour Party has presented an alternative which is back to the 70s. And I don't think anybody with any sense who sat through the boring Labour governments in the 1970s would want to really go back to that, where the unions were abusing their power and abusing their position vis-à-vis the Labour government. And the Labour government that was in power was saying Europe is not something that we want to be part of. I mean, that's all totally back to front. I think the important thing that Thatcher did, whereas the Labour Party tried to exploit class, which has always been a strong element in Britain, what's been stronger and what's been unspoken is English nationalism, as opposed to Scottish or Welsh or Irish nationalism. English nationalism, and you have to understand that the English make up 48 million of the 56 million people who live in the British Isles. English nationalism has always been incredibly xenophobic. And Thatcher has kind of mined that, the whole wrapping herself in the Union Jack, the Falklands War, the anti-European stance, we're superior to everybody else just because we're English. That runs really deep in the English, I'm ashamed to say. And she has unscrupulously exploited that. And it's kind of like gone into a totally different territory, totally different terms of debate that the Labour Party are used to. And I think they've responded very badly to it. And there's still elements within the Labour Party who are still looking back to the 70s when really they should be looking forward to the next century, really.
Have you found some of the same sentiments here in the United States? Fear of strangers, we're number one, nationalism, uber alles? Yeah,
I mean, there's definitely that there, but I mean, we're in the post-imperial position in Britain now, where you in America are still in the cultural, economical, imperial period. I mean, I do fear that the United States of America has really, because of your isolation geographically, you're not really near anywhere else apart from Canada and Mexico, has really failed to grasp how the rest of the world perceives you. And it's partly the blame of having such a localised media, but also partly because everybody in Europe reacts with total knee-jerk reaction to Americans when they come over, instead of bothering to talk to Americans and find out where they come from and how they feel about the way their country is portrayed around the world. Because I have the opportunity and the privilege to come and talk about politics with Americans, and I realise that the majority of Americans don't feel happy with the way the Reagan administration and now the Bush administration is conducting itself internationally. But unfortunately, you haven't managed to manifest that on an international scale. We're still getting Ramboism. That's the only kind of cohesive ideal that's come across the Atlantic in the last 10 years, and unfortunately the majority of the American people who disagree with that haven't found a way to manifest that feeling abroad yet.
How do people in, say, the Eastern Bloc deal with your music, and especially in the last year? Have you had a chance to contact people where revolutions really are going on? Last
February, I was at the Festival of International Song in East Berlin. It's the second time I've been invited. And at the end of the festival, I was banned from East Germany. I was told I'd never be invited again, because on stage, live on a television broadcast, I'd said that perestroika is a wonderful thing, tumultuous applause, but it'll only ever work if the Berlin Wall comes down. And I just walked off stage, and the organiser said, "That's it, forget it. You'll never come back and play." So I was overjoyed when the Berlin Wall did indeed come down. And next week I have my first opportunity to go there and see what the changes have been since then. There were already progressive changes underway. So it's going to be very interesting. And as a socialist, I learn more about my ideals by putting them in the fire and having them forged by argument, by dispute, by debate. It is a great challenge, and I'm glad it is, because it's challenging being a socialist in the United States of America, but it's also now challenging being a socialist in Eastern Europe too.
Was it a challenge to rewrite the International?
A great challenge. I was put on the spot at the Vancouver Folk Festival last year by Pete Seeger, who said he was going to sing the International in respect to the students in Tiananmen Square, who most recently, just after June 4th, had been terribly, terribly massacred by the totalitarian Deng Xiaoping. And they'd been singing the International to express their belief in a humanitarian ideal. He said, "I'm going to sing the French version. I'd like you to sing the English version tonight, Bill." And I said, "Well, I'd like to sing it, Pete, but the words are just so archaic. I mean, the third verse of the International in England begins, 'Ye peasants, artisans and others.' Others being DJs and taxi drivers, people who work in, McDonald's. It's just like, such a catch-all." It goes on to say, "Enrolled among the sons of toil, henceforth let's claim the earth for brothers, and you women can make the sandwiches." I mean, it's just desperately needed resexing. I mean, it's a very old tune. So he just fixed me with his beady eye and said, "Well, you've got 4 hours, why don't you rewrite it?" So I thought, oh dear. I mean, it's only been the international anthem of socialism and communism and anarchism for 100
Pete
years.
Seeger is talking to you.
Pete, it's very hard, it's very hard to ignore it. So I went away with a sheet of paper, managed to write one verse, and then went on to meet a lot of other people. I fortunately met a great honour to go round to the house of Ewan McCall and Peggy Seeger just before Ewan McCall sadly passed away last year, and have the opportunity to discuss with him the lyrics, and with Peggy Seeger, and they were both very friendly, very helpful, and pointed out contradictions within my lyrics and what the tradition they felt was, and eventually came with these three verses, and showed them to Seeger, and he changed one word, which was great, and that was the inspiration from it.
You might not get any requests in Prague next week, but I'll give you one.
Well, thank you.
Heat. I'm John Hockenberry. You said in the beginning of our conversation that you didn't want to become a one-dimensional political figure. Who is, and how do you prevent that?
Well, the one-dimensional figure is the person who only has their agenda and only speaks on their agenda and doesn't have any other forms of reference outside that. And whether or not that's, whether or not you're Billy Idol, who can only bring himself to talk about how he made his last record and which motorbike and leather jacket he's got, or whether you're the politico in Washington DC who's only willing to talk about politics and nothing else is interesting. It's easy to become a one-dimensional, or the sportscaster or the boring guy in the bar who only wants to talk about the Mets. It's easy to become a one-dimensional figure. In order to get your ideas across, you have to be able to not only to talk about a number of different subjects, but also to see the important intrinsic value in living in a society that has a lot of different strands that make up the whole. And if you just want to talk about one subject, if you just want to talk about soccer, if you just want to talk about guitar strings, if you just want to talk about record sales, then you really just, you're not even tipping the iceberg. I mean, obviously, as someone who has a political analysis of things, I can take that political analysis and fit it onto those sports, if you like, and we can talk about the the political side of soccer.
I have a feeling, though, as you smile, that you might have been accused once or twice in the past of only wanting to talk about soccer.
Well, we do have the World Cup breathing down our neck now, man. I mean, you have to realise that while the rest of the rest of the world for the next through June 8th to July 8th is going to be glued on what's happening in Italy, as all the world soccer teams play to see who's the world champion once every 4 years, and your country is going to blithely go on as if nothing's happening. And I would implore you to draw from this a conclusion that if the United States of America could use instead of, you see, all your sports are national sports. You play American football with other Americans and Canadians. You play baseball with Americans and Canadians. You play basketball with Americans and Canadians. If you had an international sport which you could play with other nations around the world.
Well, basketball's close.
Yeah, but not in the same way that soccer is. If you had a thing as that you could be as passionate about soccer, then you wouldn't have to invade these little countries like Panama every now and then. Because we don't have wars in Europe anymore. We fight each other over soccer now, and we have soccer tournaments, and we knock the skittles out of each other both on the pitch and on the terraces over soccer. So I'd implore you to join the world and come in, and then you can beat the Soviet Union at soccer. Remember how you felt when you beat them at ice hockey all those years ago? Imagine you beat them at soccer as well, because not only is ice hockey an obscure little game played by people who all their relatives came from Scotland originally, but soccer is a game that's played by people all over the world, and something you can sit down and have an argument with anybody about.
They play soccer all over the Middle East, but it hasn't...
They don't play with each other, though. Israel never plays any of the Arab nations.
No, they do. They actually do secretly. There's like all these rumors that crop up every once in a while that Israel secretly played the Saudis in some tournament somewhere. And
well, that's I think that's a positive thing. I mean,
but I think we should, get involved.
Definitely, because you're going to get the World Cup's here in 1994,
I know.
Whether you like it or not, and it's a great spectacle. It's a great international.
Well, maybe that's the key. Maybe the isolation will begin to melt.
I'd like to think so.
Now, if we're going to talk about American isolationism, we wouldn't be blaming Phil Oakes for that at all.
No.
There's an American.
There's a great American.
Yeah. And you have a song about him.
I do, yeah. I mean, he's one of the great unsung heroes of the American left. So I thought it was about time someone sung him. And consequently, I've stolen an old very famous Union song called Joe Hill, another great part of American culture there, and written a song about Phil Oakes, because I don't think it was enough just to cover a Phil Oakes song. I wanted to take if people are interested in listening to Billy Bragg, then they really ought to check out Phil Oakes as well. And it's a very few people, both in your country and my country, who are aware of the great contribution he made to left-wing political culture in this country during the 1960s and the early 70s.
And the name of this tune is I Dreamed I Saw Phil Oakes Last Night.
Exactly.
Billy Bragg in the studio with us, singing. Croaking. Not covering.
Croaking. A bit, I'm sorry.
Don't run yourself down, Bill. 20 years from now, a young fellow with a haircut like yours and a sweatshirt like yours might be singing The Music Business Killed You, Bill. They ignored the things you said. How would you prevent that? Or do you think it's possible?
I've looked very closely at Phil Oakes, and in some ways there's a lesson to be learned for people who are trying to do what I'm doing in mixing pop and politics. Phil Oakes mixed it in a very, very pure form, and he became very, very personally involved. And when he came to the Democratic Convention in 1968, and that watershed for all the hope of the 60s generation, what a knockback that was, he took it very, very personally, deeply personally, and went away and eventually, sadly, concluded his life by committing suicide in 1976. Now, I obviously can't get right into his mind and work out why he came to that conclusion, but I am determined to mix pop and politics in as potent a way as I can bear, but at the same time not to personalise it, to be able to step back away from it, and to be able to realise that folk singers, pop singers, people like me don't change the world. It's the audience that changes the world. And my duty, my humble duty, is to reflect the society I come from, not to lead it, but to reflect it. And if people in my audience want to change the world, my job is to say, well, it's your responsibility, not mine. Don't think you can buy a Billy Bragg album and think you've done your bit. It starts there. The argument starts there. We have to have a debate, we have to come to a conclusion, and we have to act on those conclusions. And if you don't feel that way, then nothing is going to change. If you really want things to change, then you have to take that responsibility yourself. And as a socialist, I think responsibility, social responsibility, the responsibility for other people within society, that is that's the essence of socialism.
What is the music business, and I imagine you have some sense of that, make of you?
Well, I'm kind of like the cuddly commie most of the time. They kind of wheel me on and say, well, here's Billy Bragg, and he's doing the totally opposite to everything else. And I get upset sometimes where what I'm doing is judged by the music industry's criteria. And the music industry's criteria, of course, is the Billboard Top 100 or the Top 40 in England. And if you don't sell, loads of records, and you don't get your face on the TV and on your records played. But I would ask you to cast your mind back, listeners, to the 1960s and look at Bob Dylan and the Archies, who sold more records? Undoubtedly the Archies and the people like Paul Anka, and sold more records. Neil Sedaka probably sold more records than Bob Dylan, undoubtedly. Paul Simon even, definitely. Simon and Garfunkel sold a lot more records than Bob Dylan, but in a cultural, political aspect, Bob Dylan made a much greater contribution to American popular culture than than Paul Anka and the Archies, and arguably more so than Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel.
It occurs to me to ask you about going to Eastern Europe, and that people are going to be concerned about the songs you might play. Maybe what you ought to do is write a song about the International Monetary Fund or something, or about Western money coming to your town.
Yeah, the banana vote, it's called. I don't know if you know, the Christian Democrats in West Germany, when they went into East Germany to do their meetings, took bananas and oranges to give to the kids and say, show this to your father and your mother and tell them this is what you're voting for. I mean, it's really the lowest kind of politicking that's going on over there.
So they're amazingly, the vulnerability is so unbelievable. When I was in Romania, I was in Romania last December, and people stood in line in a blizzard to just get these peanuts, these Vietnamese peanuts that most people on the other side would have taken back to the counter. And
there's an incredible vacuum over there, not just a political kind of vacuum, but a moral vacuum as well. And into it, we're seeing a lot of very, very nasty things emerging. Anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, a lot of anti-Hungarian feeling in Romania, campaigns against the Gypsies in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, a rise of fascism again. France, I'm sure you've seen the desecration of Jewish cemeteries. It's been going on. It's really on the rise. All that bad stuff is really on the rise again.
Speaking of Eastern Europe, though, and you're a student of historical process, are these lessons that are going to have to be learned in the same old, inexorably tragic way in Eastern Europe, or is there a role that people like you, or maybe politicians, or the international community can play to have them do it right, where maybe some others did it wrong?
It's very hard to say, isn't it? Because we, have we learned from our histories? I mean, do we? You look at Northern Ireland, and you think, my country, no, we've not learned from our colonial mistakes. You look at Vietnam, and then see the invasion of Panama, and think, this is the same mentality. We haven't learned. And the same with the Soviet Union. They've tried to control everything and failed. Now they're trying to control everything in a different way, failing. My only hope is that this is actually, in both literally and also spiritually, the millennium.
What do you think of this summit last week?
Well, is it in his control anymore? Does Gorbachev really control what's happening in the Soviet Union anymore? Does Bush really control what's happening here, or is it now just down to market mechanisms springing into force? Doesn't matter what Bush or Gorbachev say. I think that the Cold War, the whole Cold War propaganda thing, has just been really. I think it's just been, it's been something that's been the excuse for exploitation of different kinds around the world. It's been the justification for some unspeakable colonialism on both the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. And now that that's hopefully finished in Europe, it also has to be finished in the rest of the world, because the Cold War is still going on tonight in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. It's not over in those countries. What we refer to as the Cold War, we might not call it the Cold War anymore, but exactly the same scenario is going down. And although we should, as human beings, have the ability to learn from our mistakes, I'm not sure if we have the ability to overcome our own greed and our own selfishness. That's what I fear.
So it will just be a market malaise in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
My worst scenario for Eastern Europe is one totalitarian extreme to the other. Sort of like what we've seen in Latin America.
So they're the
capitalist-supported dictatorships.
Mm-hmm. With cheap labor being used to manufacture products for the West.
And all the cheap labor that's already in Western Europe, which mostly is from Africa and Asia, being pushed out in the most racist terms and most fascist terms. That's my worst case scenario. My best case scenario is that instead of going from sort of like totally planned economies dashing across to free market economies, that they find the middle ground and create socially responsible market economies. That is my hope, that the people of Eastern Europe say, yeah, we do want the bananas and we do want the BMWs, but we also want free healthcare and we also want the free education that we're all grown up used to. And we're going to have to create societies that allow that. And if that becomes a consensus, if socially responsible market economies become the consensus, then I think the pressure on the United States of America to join that consensus and come away from pure free market capitalism and come to a more socially responsible capitalism, which does provide for the infirm and for the uneducated and for the homeless, that does have a safety net. That's what I'm talking about. In the bottom line, socialism is about loving other people. It may not have manifested itself in this way around the world, but it's about loving other people and caring about other people. Because unless individualism is important. Your individualism and my individualism are the most important things we have. But unless we're educated collectively, unless we have collective healthcare, unless collective provision is made for those people who can't, for whatever reason, take part in the success of society, unless those things are done, then only the rich and the powerful will get to express their individuality, and you and I will be exploited by them. And so that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a collective ideal and the reforging of that collective ideal, the kind of collective ideal that built barns and houses in this country, and the founding fathers would turn out and build a place. That kind of thing. It's not alien to the United States of America. It's not alien to the Great Britain, and it's not the preserve of Trotskyists and Marxists either, and atheists as well. I mean, it's a very broad thing that goes on all over the world.
The U.S. was a model at one time for individualism and social consciousness. I mean, I say that guardedly, but now, I mean, as a hint for what might be your best case scenario, and people are looking to the political rhetoric, maybe not the market developments, but the political rhetoric in Eastern Europe as a model.
I mean, I think
it's positive.
Yeah, that is very positive, and the embracing of democracy. I mean, you know, we democracy doesn't. You sometimes hear it spoken on the TV. People, you know, democracy, capitalism equals democracy. You know, I've heard people say, you know, what political system do you live under in this country? Oh, we live under a capitalist system. You don't live under a democratic system, and capitalism is the system that you choose to run the country with. But you're fundamentally a democratic system. Hopefully, they will be able to democratise their society to the extent that people participate, so that whatever change they want and whatever they do vote in is coming from below rather than being imposed on from above, because that's all they've been. A place like Russia has no democratic tradition at all, really. You know, they've gone from Tsarism to the worst excesses of bureaucratic socialism, and they've got to forge for their own societies a whole new way of manifesting people's hopes and fears and aspirations, and that ain't easy. It took a long time in this country. It took a lot of bloodshed in my country and in Europe to do that.
Let's talk about your own backyard in the British Isles. One of the most striking songs on your album is about the conflict in Northern Ireland.
Yep.
And how relatively unchanged it is during all this exciting historical period. And
that's the frustrating thing. I mean, there's change going on all over the world, and none of the change is happening in the running saw. The thing that people all around the world look at Britain, they see Northern Ireland, and we in England don't see it at all. We have a complete blind spot there.
And it's a blind spot that's been around since William of Orange.
Exactly. Before then. But I mean, as a bleeding wound since 1969. Successive British governments have said we're not going to do anything. They've coined the term an acceptable level of violence. If you wonder what that means, listeners, that means that 2 Australian tourists are shot dead in cold blood in front of their wives and families in Holland just because they had British number plates and a short haircut. And that is what the British government and the Irish government think is an acceptable level of violence.
This song is about an acceptable level of violence, isn't it?
This song is about the killing. This song is written by a guy called Eric Bogle, who wrote The Greenfields of France and also wrote the band played Waltzing Matilda, which was recorded very well by the Pogues a few years ago. And he's a great writer of anti-war songs, and this song is incredibly anti-war, and it states for me the one certainty I feel about Northern Ireland. We're very confused in Britain about how to deliver to the Irish people peace. It's very difficult for us to sit down and talk about it because they've been blowing up our cities and because it's our army there. You know, you can't sit in a pub and have this conversation because someone sitting next to you would come over and say, "You think that? Step outside." It's very difficult. It's very difficult to do that. But the debate has to begin somewhere, and my fundamental feeling is that it has to begin with the ending of killing on both sides. And this song is a great song because of the ambiguity about whether it's a British soldier or an Irish nationalist that's killed. In the end, it's the singer's youngest son, and that's what matters in the bottom line. It's not the representatives of the Crown or the representatives of the Irish nationalists that are getting killed. It's young men, and that has to end. In the end, I think it was Winston Churchill of all people to sit down and quote, "It's better to jaw than to war."
The name of this tune?
My youngest son came home today.
Thank you, Billy Bragg.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for being here tonight.
It's my pleasure.
Singer, songwriter, activist, Billy Bragg. Support for Heat is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and WBUR, our friends in Boston. Still to come on Heat, is there really a relationship between the World Cup and world peace? We'll be talking soccer, or as they say, football, with soccer historian Sam Folds. This is Heat. I'm John Hockenberry.
Thank you for watching Cleveland Live Music. If you like what you see, hit the subscribe button. And in the video descriptions, there's further support options listed. Thanks for making the channel grow so much. Really appreciate it.